Thank you very much for participating in the Right Hive panel on Hook, Line, and Sinker, Writing the Perfect Opening Chapter. So we will begin with the first question. What do you think is important to include in an opening chapter? Jessica, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think opening chapters work the best when you're creating some sort of intrigue and creating stakes. So what I mean by intrigue is causing the reader to ask some sort of question, which means like delivering information in a way that doesn't tell the reader everything they need to know, but leaves things open-ended. So like plopping the reader right down in the middle of a scene, right down in the middle of an action, right down in the middle of some really important day immediately creates intrigue, because the reader starts to ask questions like, what is this day? Why is it important? And then hinting at what's at stake about wherever you've started the scene is also important too. So I think those are the kind of my two go-tos, stakes and intrigue.
Yeah, I love that. I think you said that almost like what I was thinking, which was to set the reader's feet down, right? Like we have to set the reader's feet down and get them walking forward, right? And so it's something about, you know, establishing like a quick setting or establishing a character who's worth following, any of that. But my two favorite things are sort of similar to what you said, like mystery and clarity, right? Two of the big reader rewards are, we want to feel like there's something that's worth figuring out. We also want to feel smart and like we've already figured out things and learned things. So if in your first chapter you can give us like a bite of world building where we're like, oh, this is how this works, that's cool. But we can also be like, wait, what was that thing? And we kind of keep moving. So I think those are great ways to open us up, invite us in. I also think, you know, if it's possible, letting us go somewhere or with someone that's not our typical, right? Like someone who we can only see it through this character's eyes, or we can only go there in this world. I think that's always pretty enticing for a first chapter too.
Do you have any favorite techniques or any favorite tropes that you think are really effective for a first chapter? Scott?
I'm trying to think through like what my first chapters are. You know, like I think it's always fun. And I think so I don't know if there's like a favorite trope. So for Nixia, I open up with like almost a board meeting, right? These 10 kids are getting invited into space and they're getting offered millions of dollars. And we're just sitting around a table being like, is this really happening? For Ash Lords, it's a girl who has a friend come over and he pulls her outside and they head to a ranch where she's going to summon a phoenix horse at sunrise because they rise with the sun. So there's I think different ways you can do it. I definitely like that concept of kind of in media res, like that idea of like sliding us seamlessly into someone's life. That's probably the trope I like most, is not to feel like we have to do this big introduction, this big like get your feet wet, here's this, here's that. I like to just sort of let you kind of glide in right behind the character and you feel like you're at their normal day. That's kind of what I like to do as my big trope, is just right into the action, so to speak.
That's cool. Yeah, I do this thing that I like to call hiding the ball, and it's where there's always something that you're hiding in the first scene. So, you know, that can be like a motivation, that can be what the character's trying to accomplish, that can be something that happened right before the scene started, and I call it just hiding the ball. So it's like the reader goes along with this creating intrigue, as the reader immediately wants to know what that thing is. So it's almost like if you know the term MacGuffin, it's like, what's the MacGuffin of the scene? So like I have, like in this book, My Life Undecided, it starts where she's getting arrested for you actually don't know what yet. So she's just talking about the sirens are coming and there's fire and there's smoke and this was a big mistake. And you actually don't find out until the second scene why she's being arrested. And then, for example, like this book, Week of Mondays, it starts out where she gets a text message from her boyfriend and he's basically like, we need to talk about last night. And she's like, oh my God, last night. And the MacGuffin or the ball is like, what happened last night? And you don't find that out until a few chapters later. So I always like to kind of hide something from the reader.
Yeah, I love that. I really love like the idea of hiding the ball. I'm gonna steal that for sure.
Go ahead, it's yours.
I really like to one of the things I like is also just like the promise of the premise almost, like, right? So just giving us enough to feel like we know where we might go. We know what the author might be promising us ahead. That's kind of one of the things to kind of always keep in mind too, is you are making promises to the reader. As soon as you open up that first sentence, it's no longer your book, it's our book together, and where are you going to take my thoughts and my words? And so I also like to think of like, what am I promising the reader as we step into the story?
That's great.
Yeah. Do you think that there are things that you've seen too often in openers or cliches that you think should be avoided with opening chapters?
Well, I was going to say, having characters who wake up on the first page, but I have like 2 books that do that. So I don't know if I should say that, but actually, no, I only have 1 book that does that. So that tends to be a trope that people tell you to avoid. So I guess you probably have to have a good reason for doing that. Yeah, I think like what Scott said earlier about like sort of that, I don't know if it's a trope or a cliche, but just something to avoid would be like that slow build up. You want to definitely drop your readers right in the middle of something so that they're immediately kind of like running as they go, as opposed to like, dropping them into a middle of like a really, I don't know, slow description or just like a bunch of thought or something like that, where they're kind of like, okay, get to the point. I don't know, Scott, can you think of any like cliches?
It's funny. It's like as soon as you think of the cliche, then someone does it in this like amazing way.
Yeah, I know, that's the problem.
It's like cliches are almost there to like be defeated.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, I do think you have to be. It helps to be aware of like your genre. It helps to be aware of like, okay, if you're talking about a horror book, this is the way they typically are set up. And so if you're following directly in those footsteps, it can feel cliche unless you're doing something a little bit new. The only thing, so like I do editorial work too. So people will send me manuscripts or the first 50 pages. It depends on what they're working on. And the one thing I run into is a character that just doesn't feel worth following almost. Either they're too mean at the start or too aggressive or too this, or it's so slow that I don't find myself leaning forward. So I don't know that there's like an overdone cliche, but I do know that because of how writing works, and especially if you're traditional publishing, especially if you're trying to get an agent and get a publisher, we lean so heavily on pitch and the first 10 to 40 pages, and those have to sing, they have to shine. And so I would say that like if you are in that mold where you're like, all right, I'm trying to figure out how to pitch to agents and query, I would definitely say have someone else, have multiple people take a strong, thorough look at that opening, just to make sure that it doesn't feel familiar. It feels like you're doing something new, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought of something else, is that something I do a lot and end up having to revise it out in future drafts. And that's, I always think that there needs to be a prologue. Like I'm always like super excited, like I'm going to make this the prologue and it's going to be so epic. And then like almost 90% of the time that prologue gets cut because it's just not necessary. And so, I talk to writers a lot about like, are prologues absolutely necessary? And you have to have a really good reason for the prologue, and it has to really sort of stand apart, and you have to kind of argue for that prologue, like create a case of why this prologue has to be there, because otherwise prologues can just feel like extra text before you actually get into the story, which is why a lot of mine end up getting cut. So, taking a look at like, am I starting in the right place? Might mean like that you need to cut some really cool thing that you set up earlier just because you thought it was kind of cool.
Yeah, and I'm like a sucker for a prologue too. Like I love a good prologue. George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones has like one of my favorite prologues ever.
Yeah.
This book right over my shoulder, The Last Son, this is a friend of mine, Katie Edwards, and like the only thing they had to cut was the prologue. That was the only edit, which is like the best edit letter you can ever get.
Cut the prologue, done.
But I love that prologue, and I was like angry it got cut because it's such a good set your feet down in the novel type prologue. Yeah, it's so interesting. I just think it's one of those situations where you can be doing the exact same plot type thing, but maybe you're doing something new with character. Or you can be doing the same character thing that happens at the start of a story, but you really do the voice just so well. And so I think as long as we have a reason to feel like you're inviting us into something new, whether it's the storytelling or the setting or the plot, that's enough to usually draw us into the story.
Why do you feel that the first chapter is so important? And like, what part of it is there a part that you feel is more important, or how quickly does it have to hook you in? And we'll go with Jessica here.
Oh, sure. These days, so fast, so quickly. Readers have much shorter attention spans than they did 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago. And now we're as writers, we used to compete with other writers. So we just had to create a really good story. Then movies came out, we had to compete with movies. Now we're competing with like 30-second YouTube videos where like, if you don't hook someone, they're gone. So I've noticed my own attention span, like when I read books, I have to force myself to read past chapter 1 if it doesn't hook me, because I'm like, well, maybe it will become better. But I feel that like pull to close the book. So I think, it needs to hook you by the end of the first page, but at the end of the first chapter for sure. And, the things that Scott and I were already saying, like, are the first page kind of hooks that you want. But by the end of the first chapter, there needs to be a sense of this story's going somewhere. There needs to be a sense of that the hero has a goal of some kind, so that the reader can really get behind that character and say, okay, I want to see if that goal pans out. There needs to be a sense of stakes by the end of the first chapter. What happens if they don't get that thing that they want? And there also needs to be a sense that this hero's life is on the verge of collapse. And that can be world collapse or just like personal collapse. So you want to build into that first chapter, all these things that are wrong in the character's life and why this story is important to be told about this character. Because if you don't build in those kinds of things, the reader goes, okay, why do I need to spend time with this person if nothing's really, if there's nothing really at stake in their life. So I think those are my go-tos for chapter 1, at least.
Yeah, I love that idea of like thinking of your competition, which is, and again, writers, we're not competitions for each other. That's not like what I mean at all. Just the fact that like a consumer has so many reasons to set a book down. Genuinely, like they can flip through the opening chapter on Amazon or in the bookstore, and if it's not for them, they're gonna set it right down. But if it intrigues, that might be enough for them to grab the book. And so I do think you have such a short time span now, and I think it gets shorter and shorter. First page is probably a good bet. I'd say I give it to at least 5 pages, and I do think I have arrived as a reader at the point where life is too short. I am not going to shove through a book unless I really feel called to shove through a book. And so I do set a lot of books down if they don't immediately grab me. One thing we haven't really talked a ton about, I think, is my big thing. Aside from like, I'm a fantasy sci-fi person, so like world building will pull me in too. But probably the bigger thing is I really want to be rooting for a character, frankly. And I think there's ways to cheat code that, right? My favorite sort of set is I used to teach sympathetic character traits. So there are probably like anywhere from 15 to 25 things that are like just little cheat codes that you can do to make us love a character. There's things like making them an underdog. We're automatically going to love an underdog in some way. You can make someone else love them, right? So Sherlock and Holmes are a great example of this. Like Sherlock's kind of a jerk, but Watson has such high affection for Sherlock that we have high affection for Sherlock. And so there's all these little tricks that you can do. And when I used to teach this, I would have my students read the first chapter of Hunger Games. And she gets like 13 of those things into that first chapter. So it's like, no surprise we love this book. No surprise that Katniss is so well loved. She's using all the tricks in the book to get us to fall for her character right away. And then we follow her through the rest of time because we want to. We want to see where she's going to go. So I think character is a big part of it for me.
That's really great. I love these little tricks that you brought up. And Katniss is such a great example because when you look at her on some levels, she's not that likable. I mean, she's sort of like grouchy. She's a little bitter. Like she wants to kill the cat, you know, which is the opposite of what I teach, save the cat.
Yeah.
But like, you know, I've never actually thought about it. Like there's other things in there. Like I always say, you know, the reason we love Katniss is because of her sister Prim. And I'm sure that's one of those things where you said like someone else who loves them or someone they're taking care of. But so that's really interesting.
Yeah. And she fits so many of them. Like, my favorite is the everyman Superman paradigm. Like we want to see characters who are like us, who really are, who are grouchy, right? We're grouchy. We know what it's like to be grouchy. So when she shows that on the page, we might not love it all the time, but we are like, I know what that feels like. I've been there. But we also want Superman qualities where it's like, I wish I could shoot a bow like that. I wish I would step up and sacrifice myself for my sister in scene 3. That's a moment where she's being the brave we hope we would be in those scenarios. So I think just like it's a masterclass, but like you look through what she does, and you're right, there are parts of her that aren't likable, but even those parts are real and honest. And honesty is super important with character work.
Well, then we've talked about Katniss here, but kind of in the same vein. What was your favorite opening that you've read and why did it stick with you? And this can be both from a book that you've written and from a book that you've read.
This is why I should have read the questions beforehand.
This is the one, I saw it earlier and I was like, oh, I should think of something because I'll get stuck. I'm going to cheat just a little and then I'm going to look at my books and come up with a different answer. One of my, there's two, I used to study movie stuff for this. Children of Men and The Truman Show are both excellent opening scenes. Truman Show just like lays the groundwork for this like curious mystery. You get drawn in, the character's fascinating, it's wonderful. But The Children of Men is one of my favorites because you have this guy walk into a coffee shop, right? And up on the screen, they're announcing the death of the youngest person in the world who is 18. And you're like, wait a minute. And so world building gets established. The best part though is he like weaves through all these people who are all fixated on what's happening on the screen, and he ignores it completely and orders a black coffee. And you're like, okay, this guy doesn't care about the rest of this that everyone else does. So we know something about the character. And then as he walks out and barely gets around the corner, the coffee shop blows up. And you're like, okay, this is gonna be violent and dangerous. And they, in 2 minutes, establish who the character is, what the world's like, and how the story's gonna go. That's like a brilliant opening.
Yeah, that's good. I was trying to like use the time you were talking to think, but then I kept getting pulled into what you were saying. I was like, yeah, that's good. Okay, so this might not be my favorite opening image, but it's the one that came to mind first. Is I love Sophie Kinsella's Shopaholic series. I mean, this is like, I'm going to go a different direction. You went some fantasy. I'm going to go like comedy. So Sophie Kinsella's books always open, first of all, with the Shopaholic series always open with the same line, which is, okay, don't panic. And she's always like there was always something she's panicking about in that scene. So the very first book opens up where she's looking at her Visa bill and she's like itemizing, going, well, that I didn't buy that. Oh, wait, no, I did buy that. And then, you know, so you're kind of seeing how she's a shopaholic, and you're also seeing like just her own sense of denial. So you really get the sense of who this character is. It's very much in her head. Which I just think is so brilliant and just kind of pulls you in. In terms of one of my own books, I think the one that I'm sort of, I don't know if I'm the proudest of, but I think it's sort of the most grabby is the first scene of my sci-fi trilogy, Unremembered. And basically it starts out where the girl is floating amongst plane crash wreckage, and she's surrounded by dead bodies. And they come, like a boat comes and pulls her out of the water, and they're asking her all these questions. And she can't remember anything, including her own name. And then they ask her, do you know what year it is? And she says 1609. And it's actually a prologue that did not get cut. But that's the first chapter. So I feel like that one is sort of my most kind of mysterious, grabby one that I really enjoyed kind of teasing the reader with.
Yeah, I love that. For mine, I forgot to plug my own books. I think Ash Lords, in part because I have 3 POVs, so I kind of get 3 first scenes. And in the 3 first scenes, I kind of give a snapshot of each character, and then the next 3 scenes is a snapshot of their family, and the next 3 scenes are the snapshots of their problems and how they're going to explode. And so it's like one of those things where I loved getting to layer it that way. But maybe Pippa's first scene sticks with me because she is such a it's in second person, so her POV second person, which I get dinged for a lot. It's very intentional, though. She's very much someone who sees herself as a brand. She's almost a Kardashian in this world. So like she's always a step removed from herself and looking at herself and almost controlling what she should do next based on what she knows she should do next based on what people are looking at. And so the first scene with her is doing this interview, and it just is this one of my favorite, like, seeing what the character is saying and what they really think, and what they say and what they really think. And I really took time sort of layering that in, and she's the reason the story exists. She came to life so vividly for me. But yeah, it's always, I don't know, I feel like I'll think about this later and feel like I have a much better answer. But
I know I'm gonna go to my bookshelf and be like, wait a minute, no, that one.
I will say the start of Game of Thrones, the first book, the first 6 chapters or so are why I wanted to be a writer. Like I read them and I was like, oh, you can write like this. That's cool. I might not ever, but that's cool.
Yeah, they're good.
Too many choices. Well then, how do you think you can include a book's promise in the opening chapter when there's magic coming, but the world as the character is in the first chapter is still mundane? How do you show that magic and give the book's promise in that opening chapter if it hasn't shown itself yet? If that makes sense.
That's hard. I mean, I think some of it can be tone, right? Some of it can be word choice, and you can really phrase things in a way that really alludes to what's coming. Some of it is trusting your reader, right? Mm-hmm. Like to see it through and hoping that maybe they read the back cover too. If that combo is happening, then you're a little out of the woods. But if it really is just like, how do I, in my first scene, make sure that I package all of this in? I think there's some sense of you have to instinctually just sort of figure out how much you need to keep the reader going to get to that part. Sometimes though, like a flash of cool magic in the first scene is what it takes, and that's okay too.
Are you saying literal magic, Casey, or like magic, like storytelling magic, like it's going to be great?
It could be either way. It could be literal magic where, there's some fantastical world coming, like a portal fantasy or such, or it could just be that, the flash in the pan hasn't quite happened yet.
Yeah. So, I teach a method called Save the Cat, which I wrote a book about it. And in Save the Cat, we call it the promise of the premise doesn't come until Act 2, until you're in Act 2, and that's where sort of the premise plays out. And so when you're reading what's on the back of the book, you're sort of referencing things that will probably not happen for a few pages, depending on the length of the novel. So that means that you have this work cut out for you at the beginning to be like, there's really cool stuff coming, but it's not here yet. And I think that kind of really goes back to all the things we've been saying about, creating sympathetic characters, creating a question that needs to be answered, hiding the ball, all those things. And I think for me, it's all about why this hero, why this character? And, because a premise is one thing, but you need to have the perfect hero to experience that premise. Otherwise, the story will just feel off balance. So, I always say it's like if you put Harry Potter in the Hunger Games, he would just wave his wand and it would be done, right? So he's not the right hero for that premise. And conversely, if you put Katniss at Hogwarts, she'd probably kick butt. So like, you want to make sure that the hero is the right person. So by setting up the hero who has problems, who I say, someone who needs fixing, is automatically kind of priming the reader for the premise and hopefully engaging them enough for them to go, I really want to find out what happens to this person because I'm, invested in them now. So in terms of like literal magic, I actually have several sort of, I guess you could call them kind of portal fantasies, but they're kind of magical realism where it's a real person who gets kind of thrust into a level of magic. So I call them wish fulfillment books. So I have a book where a girl has to relive the same Monday over and over. That's the week of Mondays. I have a book where a girl gets to experience another version of her life if she'd made a different choice, which is like a portal. And all of those, like, there's a lot of setup that I had to do in order to pay off the magic so that you understand how the magic is affecting her life. I had to set up that like sort of status quo life. And there's a lot of pages that I had to do that in. So the challenge was really sort of in creating all of these stakes within her normal life with like, you know, is she going to break up with the boyfriend after the fight they had last night, you know, and is this going to pan out? Is this going to pan out? And just kind of creating setup questions that will be answered so that when I did introduce the magic, it was putting a twist on something you'd already understood and were already kind of hoping to learn more about. But yeah, it's definitely tricky. And all of the things that we've been talking about, I think, help get the reader to that premise.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and I like do have like the magic that's going to be the magic in my book is in my first chapters several times though. So I was like thinking my own advice. I was like, you don't have to show it, but I was like, I did. So like, I do think you can have a taste test. So in Nixia, they have an alien substance that is creatively manipulable. So you can manipulate it with your mind, right? So in that first scene, when they're getting this breakdown from this company, inviting them into this competition, there is a flash where he shows them a piece of Nixia and he manipulates it in front of them. And so it's like, we get a taste of it, but they're obviously going to get way more time, way more in depth with what that substance really is later in the book. Same with Ash Lords, right? In that first scene, we watch a horse come to life, and we do see a very cool horse pull off a very cool trick. But later in the races, when they're using alchemy to change what type of horse they're riding from day to day, that's when the true magic of this idea is coming in full. So it's kind of like a little bit of a taste test that says, wait, like something else is around the corner. And it does not have to be the little magic. I did that. It can be, you know, as Jessica said, a character, a setting, a something that pulls us on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all right, then. We still have a few minutes. Do either of you have any other topics that you feel are relevant or you'd like to discuss?
Well, I'll ask Scott a question. You know, you obviously do a lot of world building. So how do you ensure that your world building is immersive right from the start and that you're not, you know I get this question a lot, so I'd love to hear your answer, that you're not just sort of like, you know, dumping the hero into a scene and then dumping a bunch of details on the reader of like, here's all the things you need to know for this scene to make sense.
Yeah, that's such a good question too. I think that's one of those things, the balance of that, right? Like how much to share, how much not to share, when to pull this out, when to pull that out. You know, there's some, gosh, I'm blanking on the author's name, but she talked about it as like thinking through your reader's book pack, right? They have a book bag. And when you put things in there, everything weighs something. And if you put enough things in there without anything cool happening, without anything flashing, then it kind of feels like we're just carrying this heavy book bag around. And you don't want to weigh a reader down so much that they get to a point where they're like, I'm going to put this down and walk away, which means they're putting down your book. But I think there is this element of instinct, right, that you learn with repetition, that you just get better at like, oh, I don't need all that right now. I'm going to give this little taste and then move us on. And then I also just think there's an element of like truly knowing your world and your magic and how it works. You know, treating it that, you know, the iceberg method is always a fun one, in my opinion. This idea of like, you need to know all 100%, but maybe your reader needs to know about 10%. And maybe as it goes, that ratio changes a bit because they get to add on to that. But I think at the beginning, trust your reader. Trust your reader to piece together a few things. And it depends on which reader. Like if you're writing middle grade or YA or adult, you get a little bit of a different license with each of those audiences, I think. But yeah, I think I build my worlds with the rule of cool. Like I 100% want it to be larger than life and feel gripping. And so if I'm not doing that as I read through and write through myself, then I know the reader's going to be as lost or feel as bored as I feel. And so as long as I've got my fingers on the pulse of like, okay, this is what was cool about this scene. This was what was cool about this scene. Oh, and this levels it up here. As long as something like that's happening, I feel like I'm going to move my reader from page 1 to end without skipping much of a beat. But I'm curious what your answer is to this.
Well, no, you have a great answer, and you've obviously have more experience. I've written one otherworld sci-fi trilogy, so I'm much newer at it than you are. I guess the one thing that it was a co-written project. It was, no, I should pull it up. It's the first book's called Sky Without Stars. It was a sci-fi reimagining of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables set on a distant planet. And the one thing that we sort of figured out is that every world building element needs to be triggered by something that's happening in the plot. So, the way to make something immersive is to make sure that the character is interacting with it, and that there's not like, oh, by the way, you also need to know this. Well, if the reader really does need to know that, then the hero or the character needs to interact with it. And it's always every world building element needs to be filtered through your character's experience. So, like I say, like if you're going to invent some kind of like cool food, that does something in this world, then maybe the character's allergic to it, or maybe the character, and eats it and is poisoned, or maybe the character avoids it at all costs because of something that happened in their past with this food. Like always think about how it affects the character and how it filters through. And that will allow your reader to also be immersed in the world too, because they're seeing the world through the eyes of the character. And then in terms of like triggering, external plot points or triggering release of information. I love the book bag thing, by the way. I forgot to say that. That is just like the coolest analogy.
I forget who it was. I'm gonna remember right after we finish the session.
Yeah.
But she had a great blog post about it where it was just thinking about what you're putting in, and basically every cool thing that happens is like setting down a load. Like you don't feel like you're carrying as much because you just experienced something cool, so you forget you have something heavy in your book bag.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I love that. So, when I think about like external plot points that trigger a reveal of information, so you have to like the reader has to earn the information, so that they have to keep reading to get more information is always my rule, is that you should never give it to them for free. They have to keep reading to get it. So, triggering world building by external plot points is all about the way that the character is interacting with that world and making sure that, the actual world building that you're doing is relevant to the plot, to the character at that moment. So if you're sort of like, dumping a bunch of stuff at the beginning because you think eventually the character will need to know it, well, then maybe, hold it off until the reader needs to know. Maybe hold it off until the reader does need to know it, or you can build something in that the character can immerse with. And I think also there's like one thing I always tell people is like, this is all like revision stuff. First draft is like free for all. You info dump as much as you want. You like get it all on the page because it's all such a discovery process. And I think sometimes people get sort of all this advice we're giving you. I think, keep it in your back brain, but don't worry about it for now if you're writing a first draft, because it'll just overwhelm you and you'll go like, I'm doing everything wrong, and you'll never move forward. So, that is all to say, like, discover the story in the first draft, get all those details about the world and the character down whenever they come to you, and then later figure out what to do with them and where to sparse them out. Because, I think a lot of writers never finish a first draft because they're so worried about how it all pieces together and they don't have all the pieces yet. So it's like trying to do a puzzle when you honestly are missing pieces. So I always think of the first draft as like literally drawing the pictures on the puzzle pieces so that you know what you have. And then the revision is when you actually assemble the pieces together, because at that point you have a perspective of what you want it to look like.
Yeah. And one of the things that it's like very common. So my writing group, I'll get it a lot, which is like, I think you were trying to figure out how this works right here. And you're going to go back and you're going to edit and probably take out some of these paragraphs because it was you writing your way through the world building, or writing your way through, okay, I think this is his history. So I think there's stuff like that where, of course, like during process stuff, you're really trying to just get the story out and get it on the page. The other thing I think I see a lot, and it's okay to, again, do this in a first draft, is the tendency to overcomplicate. Like we shove everything in the kitchen sink in. And of course, the story, instead of feeling like it's epic, starts to feel convoluted. And so one of the things, especially if you're just starting out, if you're newer to writing, is to simplify. My first book I tried to take on was like 6 point of views. I was obsessed with Game of Thrones. I thought I could pull that off. And I had a writing friend who was like, Scott, like, what if you dial it back just a little? And I was like, okay. And so I started writing one point of view books, and I needed to do that because I didn't have the chops yet to pull the other one off. I didn't know how to write that yet. I thought I did because I'd read it, but I really hadn't practiced writing enough. So I think there's some element too of like, you'll get more comfortable with it. You'll start to put your fingers again on the pulse of what needs to be there, what doesn't need to be there, and really what excites the reader and what bores the reader. You know, Elmore Leonard has that whole leave out the part that readers skip, and it's like, you don't know that at first. You don't know readers are skipping over these 2 paragraphs because they're too long or they're too heavy or they're too dense. And you don't know what techniques work for you. I'm getting long-winded, but the last son right here, Katie Edwards, again, has this cool technique that I haven't figured out how to use yet, but he does do the info dump, but it's deliberate and honest. And it's in these quick hitting 3-paragraph sections where he's pulled away from the rest of the narrative, and he writes them so sharply and they're so succinct and interesting that we don't care. It's like a quick Wikipedia article where we're like, I kind of like that. And it's still in the voice of the character a little bit. So I think, you know, that's a technique that I love, and I'll figure out how to use it one day, but I've kind of back pocketed it for now.
That's great. Like lean into the info dump.
Absolutely. Make it intentional and run with it. Well, unless we have anything else that you'd like to discuss today, we'll turn this over to the questions. Thank you very much for being a part of this, and we'll see what people have to say.